Okay, so today we're diving into something I think a lot of our listeners are going to find particularly interesting, especially given the kinds of topics we cover here.
Yeah.
It's this whole philosophical debate surrounding cognitive disability and moral status.
Right.
And really, it's like, uh, at its core, how do philosophers approach this question of like, who counts, morally speaking, and why?
Yeah, and I think for anyone who, enjoys listening to this show and, really kind of enjoys thinking about these things philosophically, this is a really interesting area.
Absolutely.
And there's definitely no easy answers here, right? It's a really sort of rich and complicated debate.
Yeah, and so that's kind of our mission here. We're
Yeah.
going to go deep. We're going to really unpack how different philosophers are thinking about these issues.
Exactly.
Try to pinpoint what the core disagreements are, and hopefully at the end of it, you'll come away with a much clearer understanding of this debate.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess just to jump right in, one of the first things I wanted to ask you is why has cognitive disability become such a central point in discussions about moral status for philosophers?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's tricky, right? Because in a way, it seems like it should be obvious.
Right.
Like why are we even having this conversation?
Yeah.
But I think the reason why it's become such a central point is really because it forces us to think carefully about what the grounds of moral status are in the first place. So, the real sort of issue here is, do things like self-awareness, practical rationality, the ability to engage in moral judgment, do those things actually determine whether you have moral status or not?
Right.
And if the answer is yes, then what are the implications for individuals who lack those attributes?
Right.
So, what about, individuals who have very severe cognitive disabilities?
Right.
What does that mean for how we treat them? And then it sort of, the ripple effects start to kind of go out from there,
Right.
right? I mean, so then we have to think about, well, what about animals?
Right.
What about fetuses?
Right.
Where do we draw these lines? And it just raises some really, really sort of foundational questions about our moral obligations towards various types of beings.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that I think is really fascinating is that it's not just an abstract thought experiment, right?
Right.
This has real world consequences. So, for instance, when we're thinking about medical research, what are the ethical guidelines for conducting research on individuals who might not be able to provide informed consent?
Yeah.
How do we think about resource allocation? And then just, even on a day-to-day basis, how should we interact with individuals who have cognitive disabilities?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, all those practical ethical questions really stem from how we think about these fundamental questions of moral status. So, yeah, it has huge implications.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So for a philosopher then who's trying to navigate this space, what are like the main lines of argument?
Okay. Yeah. So I guess we can sort of break things down, I think, into three broad categories.
Okay.
So the first would be what we call individually based accounts of moral status. And this is probably the most intuitive approach. This is the idea that your moral status depends on, certain properties or attributes that you have as an individual. So, things like self-awareness, the ability to plan for the future, maybe certain cognitive capacities, those sorts of things.
Okay.
Then we have what we could call group-based accounts of moral status. And the basic idea here is that your moral status is determined by your membership in a certain group.
Right.
So the classic example here would be species membership. So, if you're a human being, that's enough to give you full moral status.
Right.
And then we have a third category, which I think is kind of a grab bag of different views that are trying to, in a sense, kind of bridge the gap between these first two approaches.
Oh, okay.
So, this is where you might find things like proxy moral status,
Huh.
where maybe someone acquires moral status through their relationship with someone else. Or maybe, there's this idea of like presumptive moral status, where we basically just assume everyone has full moral status unless we have some really, really strong reason to think otherwise.
Right.
So those are kind of the three main areas that we're going to be looking at today.
Okay, great. So let's start with these individually based accounts.
Okay. Yeah.
What's like the core philosophical intuition behind them?
Yeah. So like I said, I think it's the most intuitive approach to moral status. We tend to think that, there's something about our capacities that makes us worthy of moral consideration. So the common examples of individually based accounts would be, first of all, what we call interest-based accounts. And the idea here is that certain psychological attributes give you moral status because they give rise to interests.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you are capable of feeling pain, then you have an interest in avoiding pain.
Right.
And that interest in itself is something that we ought to respect morally.
Okay. Yeah, that seems pretty plausible, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, if I can imagine something suffering, I don't want it to suffer.
Right, exactly. So it seems like, at least at first glance, the idea that interests ground moral status is pretty compelling.
Right.
But there are some problems with it.
Okay.
So one problem is that interests come in different degrees of complexity.
Okay.
Right. So, my interest in, finishing this podcast episode might be a more complex interest than, my cat's interest in getting food.
Right.
And so if moral status just depends on how complex your interests are, then it seems like there's going to be this kind of spectrum of moral status.
Right.
Some beings will have more moral status than others.
And that's sort of philosophically unsatisfying in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, our concept of moral status seems to be much more kind of black and white, right?
Yeah.
You either have it or you don't.
Right.
It's not really clear that there are these kind of like in-between cases.
Right.
So that's one problem for interest-based accounts.
Okay.
Another problem, which is related to this, is it's just really hard to draw a sharp line between beings that have moral status and beings that don't. So, if my cat has some moral status because she has interests, even if they're not very complex, then, what about a worm?
Right.
What about a bacteria?
Right.
Where do we draw the line?
Right.
And so those are some worries for the interest-based approach.
Okay, so then what about the source mentions categorical interest-based approaches?
Right.
What are those trying to do?
Yeah, so these are a bit more sophisticated versions of interest-based accounts. And the idea here is to try to identify a particular type of interest that is only had by beings with moral status.
Okay. Yeah.
So one example of this would be the capacity to value your own existence.
Okay.
So the idea here is that if you are capable of valuing your own life, then you have a much stronger interest in continuing to exist than, just simply having an interest in, say, avoiding pain.
Right.
And that stronger interest might be enough to ground moral status.
Okay.
So another example would be the capacity to see yourself as a being that exists through time.
Okay.
So if you can, think about your past and you can think about your future and you can sort of see yourself as this kind of continuous entity, that might also give you a stronger interest in continuing to live than just the basic interest in avoiding pain.
Right.
So those are some examples of categorical interest-based approaches.
Okay, but I guess even there's still the question of, does everyone, meet that threshold?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be the case that even if you have a categorical interest, there might still be some beings that don't have it.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, what about very young infants?
Right.
It's not clear that they're really capable of thinking about themselves as existing through time.
Right.
And what about individuals with certain types of cognitive disabilities?
Right.
It might be the case that their ability to value their own existence is impaired in some way.
Right.
So even with the categorical interest-based approaches, we're still left with this, this problem of who gets included and who gets excluded.
Right. Right. Okay. So, I mean, another big kind of framework in moral philosophy is Kantian ethics.
Right.
So how do Kantian-inspired accounts of moral status deal with this issue of cognitive disability?
Yeah. So Kantian ethics really sort of emphasizes the idea of respect for persons.
Uh-huh.
And the idea is that persons or beings that are capable of autonomy and moral responsibility have a special kind of dignity.
Yeah.
And that means that we have certain obligations towards them that we don't have towards other types of beings.
Right.
So, for instance, we should never treat a person as a mere means to an end.
Right.
We should always treat them as ends in themselves.
Right.
So the problem here, obviously, is that not everyone is capable of autonomy and moral responsibility.
Right.
Right. So, very young infants, they're not autonomous. They don't really have the ability to make their own choices.
Right.
And the same is true for, individuals with very severe cognitive disabilities.
Right.
So the question for the Kantian is, well, what about those individuals?
Right.
Do they have the same moral status as fully autonomous rational agents?
Right.
And there's a lot of debate within Kantian ethics about how to deal with this. Some Kantians think that, even if you're not currently capable of autonomy, you might have the potential for autonomy.
Okay.
Right. So, an infant will eventually develop into a rational autonomous agent.
Right.
And so maybe they should be granted some kind of moral status on the basis of that potential.
Right.
Other Kantians think that, even if you don't have autonomy yourself, you might be related to someone who does have autonomy.
Okay.
Right. So, a parent might have a special obligation to their child, even if that child is not yet capable of autonomy.
Right.
But this obviously raises some questions about, well, what about individuals who don't have those kinds of relationships?
Right.
It's not really clear how the Kantian is going to give a satisfactory answer to that question.
Right. Right. Okay. So, we've got these different individually based accounts, but I guess, one thing that's striking to me is that they all seem to run into the same problem, which is how do you set the threshold?
Right. Right. So, you were talking about how, maybe it's having complex interests, or maybe it's, the ability to see yourself as existing over time or to value your own existence. Or, for the Kantian, it's the ability to be autonomous and morally responsible. But how do we know where to draw that line?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, and I think it's one of the biggest challenges for any kind of individually based account of moral status.
Right.
Because like you said, a lot of these capacities seem to be things that come in degrees.
Right.
It's not like you either have rationality or you don't. It's more like there's this kind of spectrum of rationality.
Right.
And so the question is, well, where on that spectrum do you suddenly acquire moral status?
Right.
And that's a question that philosophers have been debating for centuries. And I don't think there's any easy answer to it.
Yeah.
But it's a problem that we have to take seriously. Yeah. And I mean, I guess this is what you were referring to earlier as that philosophical blowback.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Because if you take those sorts of arguments seriously, it seems to lead to some really uncomfortable conclusions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of people, that's one of the biggest reasons to be skeptical of individually based accounts.
Right.
Because if we say that, only beings with certain cognitive capacities have moral status, then it seems like we're opening the door to treating human beings who lack those capacities in ways that we would never think of treating other human beings.
Right.
Right. So, for instance, if someone is incapable of consenting to medical research, and we think that moral status depends on the ability to consent, then it seems like it would be okay to experiment on that person without their consent.
Right.
And obviously that's a really disturbing thought.
Right. Right.
And so I think for a lot of people, that's just a reductio ad absurdum of individually based accounts of moral status.
Right. And I mean, this is where that comparison to animals often comes up, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Oh.
Because, if we're going to say that moral status depends on, certain cognitive capacities, then we have to ask, well, what about animals?
Right.
Some animals seem to have pretty sophisticated cognitive abilities.
Right.
They can solve problems, they can communicate with each other, they can even seem to display certain kinds of emotions.
Right.
And so the question is, well, if those animals have similar cognitive capacities to, say, a human infant or a human being with severe cognitive disabilities, then why do we treat them so differently?
Right. Right.
Why is it okay to experiment on animals, but not okay to experiment on human beings with similar cognitive capacities?
Right.
And I think that's a really, really tough question to answer.
Yeah.
And I think it's a question that a lot of philosophers are struggling with right now.
Right. And I mean, I guess it's also it raises questions about like what are the methods that we're using to answer these questions.
Right.
So like the source talks about how a lot of this debate hinges on intuitions,
Right.
and considered judgments.
Yeah, yeah. And this is always kind of a tricky thing in moral philosophy because, intuitions can be unreliable.
Right.
Right. And, different people have different intuitions. And so how do we decide which intuitions are the right ones?
Right.
And so, there's a really interesting debate about this going on right now in moral philosophy. And one of the things that some philosophers have argued is that, well, maybe we should just bite the bullet and say that our intuitions about the moral status of cognitively disabled human beings are just wrong, right? And maybe, the individually based accounts are actually right.
Right.
But, obviously that's a really hard pill to swallow. And so other philosophers have tried to come up with ways of defending those intuitions.
Right.
So, there's this argument that's sometimes called the parity argument, which basically says that, well, look, if you think it's wrong to experiment on a human infant, then you should also think it's wrong to experiment on an animal with similar cognitive capacity.
Right.
And so, that's one way of trying to justify those intuitions.
Right.
But obviously the debate is still ongoing.
Right. Right. Okay. So we've got these individually based accounts. And they seem to run into a lot of problems. So I guess now we should move on to these attempts to be more inclusive.
Right, yeah.
So what are some of the ways that philosophers have tried to do that?
Yeah, so I think one of the most common ways that philosophers have tried to be more inclusive is to say that, well, maybe there are other capacities besides the ones we've been talking about that are relevant to moral status.
Okay.
So, instead of focusing on rationality or self-consciousness, maybe we should focus on, the ability to communicate.
Okay.
Or maybe we should focus on, the ability to form relationships.
Right.
Or the ability to experience emotions.
Okay.
So there's a philosopher named Jess McMahon who's written a lot about this. And he argues that one of the things that makes us morally significant is our capacity to have what he calls person-affecting relations.
Okay.
So, the ability to love someone, the ability to care for someone, the ability to be loved and cared for by someone, those are all person-affecting relations.
Okay.
And McMahon thinks that, even if someone is not capable of, say, rationality, they might still be capable of having these kinds of relationships.
Right.
And that might be enough to give them moral status.
Okay. Yeah, that seems like a really important point. Right. I mean, even if someone can't engage in abstract reasoning, we can still have these deep and meaningful connections with them.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, for a lot of people, that's really compelling.
Right.
Right. It seems like the ability to love and be loved is really fundamental to what it means to be a person.
Right.
And so, yeah, McMahon's view, I think, is really interesting. And it's certainly a way of trying to be more inclusive.
Right.
But there are still some questions about whether it goes far enough.
Okay.
So, even if we focus on these more relational capacities, it's still possible that there are some beings who don't have them.
Right.
Right. So, what about someone who's in a persistent vegetative state?
Right.
They're not really capable of having any kind of meaningful relationship with another person.
Right.
And so the question is, well, does McMahon's view imply that they don't have moral status?
Right.
That's a question that he has to grapple with.
Right. Right. Okay. So what about the concept of potential?
Right.
So the source talks about how some philosophers have tried to ground moral status in the potential for a being to develop certain capacities.
Right. Yeah. And this is a pretty common move, especially when we're talking about, infants or fetuses.
Right.
Right. Because, obviously they don't currently have the same capacities as an adult human being.
Right.
But, they have the potential to develop those capacities.
Right. Yeah.
And so the question is, well, is that potential enough to give them moral status?
Right.
And, there are some philosophers who think that it is.
Okay.
They argue that, a fetus is basically just a human being at an earlier stage of development.
Right.
And so if we think that adult human beings have moral status,
Mm-hmm.
then it seems like we should also think that fetuses have moral status.
Right.
But again, there are some worries about this. One worry is that potential is a pretty slippery concept.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So, if I have the potential to become a great artist, does that mean that I should be treated as a great artist now?
Right.
Obviously not.
Right.
And so the question is, well, what kind of potential is relevant to moral status?
Right.
And, that's not really clear.
Right.
Another worry is that not everyone has the same potential.
Right.
So, if a fetus has the potential to develop into a rational, autonomous agent, What about, an embryo that has a severe genetic defect?
Right.
It might be the case that that embryo will never develop into a being with those capacities.
Right.
And so the question is, well, does it still have moral status?
Right.
And that's a really, really tough question.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think the potential argument is it's interesting, but it's ultimately not very convincing.
Okay. So, I guess the other kind of approach here is, are these group-based accounts? Right.
So let's talk about those.
Okay. Yeah.
What are like the main types of group-based accounts?
Yeah. So I think the most common type of group-based account is a species-based account.
Okay.
And the basic idea here is that all members of the human species have moral status simply by virtue of being human.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter whether you're, a genius or you have severe cognitive disabilities.
Right.
If you're a human being, you have moral status.
Okay.
And there are a few different ways of defending this view.
Okay.
One way is to appeal to the idea of human dignity. So, some philosophers argue that there's something special about human beings.
Right.
We're the only species that's capable of rational thought. We're the only species that's capable of moral judgment.
Right.
And so, that gives us a special kind of dignity.
Right.
And that dignity is something that all human beings share.
Okay.
Another way of defending this view is to appeal to the idea of shared vulnerability. Okay.
So the idea here is that all human beings are vulnerable in certain ways.
Right.
We're all capable of suffering. We're all capable of being harmed.
Right.
And so, we have a special obligation to protect each other from those kinds of harms.
Okay.
And then another way of defending this view is to appeal to the idea of solidarity.
Okay.
So the idea here is that, we're all in this together.
Right.
We're all human beings. We're all part of the same species.
Right.
And so, we have an obligation to look out for each other.
Okay.
So those are some of the main ways of defending a species-based account of moral status.
Okay.
But there are also some worries about this view.
Okay.
One worry is that it seems arbitrary.
Okay.
Right. So why should species membership be the thing that determines moral status?
Right.
Why not, intelligence?
Right.
Or, the ability to feel pain.
Right.
Or, some other capacity. It's not really clear why species membership should be privileged over those other capacities.
Right. Right. Okay. So, I guess, one of the other things that the source mentions is this idea of humanity as the ground of full moral status.
Right. Yeah.
So how is that different from a species-based account?
Yeah. So I think the key difference here is that a species-based account is really just focused on the biological category of being human.
Okay.
Right. So if you have human DNA, then you're a human being and you have moral status.
Okay.
Whereas this idea of humanity as the ground of full moral status is a bit more nuanced.
Okay.
So the idea here is that there's something about our shared humanity, our shared human experience that makes us morally significant.
Okay.
So it's not just about our biology. It's about, our capacity for culture, our capacity for language, our capacity for relationships.
Right.
Those are things that even individuals with cognitive disabilities can participate in to some extent.
Right.
And so the idea is that that shared humanity is what gives us moral status.
Okay.
And so, this is a way of trying to be more inclusive than a purely species-based account.
Okay.
But again, there are some worries about this view.
Okay.
One worry is that it's not really clear what it means to be human.
Okay.
Right. We talk about human nature, we talk about the human experience, but, those are pretty vague concepts.
Right.
And so the question is, well, can we actually give those concepts, precise enough definition that we can use them to determine moral status?
Yeah. Right.
Another worry is that, even if we can define what it means to be human, it's not clear that all human beings actually share that essence.
Okay.
Right. So, like I said, even individuals with cognitive disabilities can participate in human culture and human relationships to some extent.
Right.
But, it might be the case that their participation is so limited that they're not really, fully human in the relevant sense.
Right.
And so, again, we're left with this problem of who gets included and who gets excluded.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, this has been a really fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this debate.
Yeah, definitely.
But I guess, to kind of bring things to a close, what are some of the key takeaways that you would want our listeners to walk away with?
Yeah, so I think the first takeaway is that this is a really, really difficult issue.
Right.
There are no easy answers.
Right.
There are good arguments on both sides of the debate.
Right.
I don't want to give the impression that there's one right answer here.
Right.
I think it's something that we all need to think carefully about.
Right.
And we need to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
Right.
I think.